Question 1. Governance review demonstrates that the firm's current assessment of needs (AON) process has significant gaps, potentially leading to advice that may not be fully suitable for all clients. The compliance department has flagged these issues, but the business development team is concerned that addressing them immediately will disrupt ongoing client relationships and may lead to client attrition. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm? Option A. Inform the business development team that the identified issues are minor and do not warrant immediate significant changes, suggesting only superficial adjustments to the AON process. Option B. Immediately implement a comprehensive plan to rectify the identified deficiencies in the AON process, prioritizing client suitability and regulatory compliance, while communicating transparently with affected clients about the improvements being made. Option C. Instruct the compliance department to reevaluate the AON process with a focus on finding justifications for the current methodology, rather than identifying further improvements. Option D. Acknowledge the findings internally but defer significant changes to the AON process until after the current quarter's business targets have been met, to minimize disruption to client relationships. Correct answer is B. Immediately implement a comprehensive plan to rectify the identified deficiencies in the AON process, prioritizing client suitability and regulatory compliance, while communicating transparently with affected clients about the improvements being made. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to maintain client relationships and the regulatory obligation to act with integrity and in the best interests of clients. The firm's assessment of the AON, assessment of needs, process is critical, as it underpins the suitability of advice provided. The pressure to overlook or downplay identified shortcomings in the AON process to avoid client dissatisfaction or potential loss of business creates an ethical dilemma. Careful judgment is required to balance commercial interests with regulatory compliance and client welfare. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and client protection. By acknowledging the identified deficiencies in the AON process and taking immediate steps to rectify them, the firm demonstrates a commitment to the principles of acting with integrity, due care, and in the best interests of clients. This aligns with the fundamental duties expected of financial professionals under relevant regulatory frameworks, which mandate robust client assessment procedures to ensure advice is suitable. Proactive remediation mitigates future risks and upholds the firm's reputation for professionalism and ethical conduct. An incorrect approach that involves downplaying or ignoring the identified issues in the AON process represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would breach the duty to conduct adequate client assessments, potentially leading to unsuitable advice being provided. Such an approach could also be seen as a failure to act with integrity and in the best interests of clients, as it prioritizes short-term commercial gains over long-term client welfare and regulatory adherence. Furthermore, deliberately concealing or misrepresenting the findings of a governance review could constitute a breach of reporting obligations and potentially mislead both clients and regulators. Another incorrect approach, such as delaying remediation until a more convenient time without a clear plan or justification, also falls short. While not as egregious as outright denial, it still risks providing unsuitable advice in the interim and demonstrates a lack of commitment to timely and effective compliance. This can erode client trust and expose the firm to regulatory scrutiny. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of regulatory obligations, a commitment to ethical principles, and a structured approach to risk management. Professionals should 1. Identify the core issue and potential conflicts. 2. Consult relevant regulatory requirements and internal policies. 3. Assess the potential impact on clients and the firm. 4. Prioritize actions that uphold regulatory compliance and client best interests. 5. Document all decisions and actions taken. 6. Seek guidance from compliance or legal departments when in doubt. Question 2. The analysis reveals that a financial advisor conducting an AON assessment for a client has identified an investment opportunity that aligns with the client's stated financial goals. However, the advisor also stands to receive a significant referral fee from the investment provider, a fact not immediately apparent to the client. The advisor is considering whether to recommend this investment without explicitly detailing the referral fee. Option A. Recommend the investment to the client and subtly highlight the potential benefits without disclosing the referral fee, trusting the client's judgment. Option B. Recommend the investment to the client, but only after fully disclosing the referral fee and explaining its implications, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Option C. Decline to recommend the investment and suggest alternative options that do not involve any referral fees. To avoid any perception of conflict, Option D. Recommend the investment to the client without mentioning the referral fee, assuming the investment's merit is sufficient justification. The correct answer is B. Recommend the investment to the client, but only after fully disclosing the referral fee and explaining its implications, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where a financial advisor, operating under the AON assessment framework, faces a conflict between client interests and personal gain. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires the advisor to navigate potential conflicts of interest, uphold fiduciary duties, and adhere to the specific ethical guidelines and regulatory requirements of the AON assessment. The advisor must prioritize the client's best interests above all else, even when presented with an opportunity that might benefit them personally. The correct approach involves transparently disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the client and seeking their informed consent before proceeding. This aligns with the core principles of professional conduct and the regulatory expectations of the AON assessment, which emphasize honesty, integrity, and acting in the client's best interest. By disclosing the situation, the advisor allows the client to make an informed decision, thereby maintaining trust and upholding their fiduciary responsibility. This approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing client welfare and adhering to ethical standards. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the recommendation without full disclosure. This constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of ethical principles. Specifically, it could be seen as a failure to act with integrity and in the client's best interest, potentially leading to a misrepresentation of advice. Another incorrect approach would be to subtly steer the client towards the investment without explicit disclosure, hoping they would not notice the personal benefit. This is deceptive and undermines the trust essential in the advisor-client relationship, violating the spirit and letter of professional conduct guidelines. Professionals in similar situations should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This should be followed by a thorough understanding of relevant regulatory requirements and ethical codes, such as those embedded within the AON assessment. The next step is to evaluate the impact of the conflict on the client's interests. If a conflict exists, the professional must then consider options for mitigation, with full and transparent disclosure to the client being the primary and often mandatory step. If the conflict cannot be adequately mitigated or disclosed, the professional should consider withdrawing from the situation to avoid compromising their ethical obligations. Question 3. Strategic planning requires a systematic approach to process optimization within a financial advisory firm, considering the need to enhance efficiency while upholding regulatory standards and client service quality. Which of the following strategies best aligns with best professional practice? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing advisory workflows, gathering data on performance metrics and identifying key pain points, followed by a pilot implementation of proposed changes with input from compliance and legal teams. Option B. Prioritize the reduction of internal documentation requirements to speed up advisory report generation, without consulting the compliance department on potential regulatory implications. Option C. Immediately implement a new, faster advisory software solution across all departments to reduce processing times, deferring detailed process analysis until after the transition. Option D. Focus on streamlining client onboarding procedures by reducing the number of required data points, assuming that efficiency gains will naturally lead to better compliance. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing advisory workflows, gathering data on performance metrics and identifying key pain points, followed by a pilot implementation of proposed changes with input from compliance and legal teams. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between achieving efficiency gains through process optimization and maintaining the integrity of client advice and regulatory compliance. The need to balance speed with accuracy and adherence to established procedures is paramount. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, data-driven analysis of existing processes before implementing changes. This aligns with regulatory expectations for robust internal controls and a commitment to providing accurate, compliant advice. By involving relevant stakeholders, including compliance and legal teams, it ensures that any proposed optimizations are vetted against regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. This proactive engagement mitigates the risk of unintended consequences, such as breaches of client confidentiality, misinterpretation of regulations, or the introduction of new operational risks. It demonstrates a commitment to a systematic and responsible approach to change management, which is a cornerstone of sound financial advisory practice. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on speed without adequate analysis risks regulatory breaches. For instance, rushing the implementation of a new advisory workflow without proper testing or stakeholder consultation could lead to errors in client documentation, miscommunication of advice, or failure to capture essential client information, all of which could violate data protection regulations and professional conduct standards. Another incorrect approach that bypasses compliance review for the sake of expediency would be a direct ethical and regulatory failure. Compliance is not an optional add-on. It is a fundamental requirement. Ignoring it to accelerate a process exposes the firm and its clients to significant legal and reputational damage, and contravenes the principles of professional integrity and client duty of care. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of process optimization. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of current processes, identifying bottlenecks and areas for improvement. Crucially, this assessment must include a risk analysis, considering potential regulatory, ethical, and operational impacts. Any proposed changes should then be evaluated against these risks and objectives, with input from all relevant departments, particularly compliance and legal. Pilot testing and phased implementation, coupled with ongoing monitoring and feedback loops, are essential to ensure that optimizations are effective, compliant, and sustainable. Question 4. Research into optimizing the AON assessment process has identified several potential strategies. Which of the following strategies, if implemented, would best align with the principles of process optimization while upholding the integrity and fairness of the assessment? Option A. Implementing a phased rollout of revised assessment modules, preceded by rigorous pilot testing with diverse candidate groups, and followed by a comprehensive review of assessment outcomes and candidate feedback to inform further adjustments. Option B. Introducing new assessment tools based on emerging trends without prior validation or comparison to existing methods, assuming they will inherently improve efficiency. Option C. Prioritizing the reduction of assessment duration and administrative costs by streamlining all components, even if it means a less detailed evaluation of candidate competencies. Option D. Reducing the number of assessment stages by eliminating subjective evaluation components, relying solely on automated scoring of objective questions to expedite the process. The correct answer is A. Implementing a phased rollout of revised assessment modules, preceded by rigorous pilot testing with diverse candidate groups, and followed by a comprehensive review of assessment outcomes and candidate feedback to inform further adjustments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between achieving efficiency and maintaining the integrity of the assessment process. The need to optimize the AON assessment process requires a nuanced understanding of how changes might impact fairness, accuracy, and the ability to identify suitable candidates, all within the bounds of regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in balancing speed and resource allocation with the fundamental purpose of the assessment, which is to evaluate competence and suitability. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven, and iterative refinement of the assessment process. This involves clearly defining objectives for optimization, such as improving candidate experience or reducing administrative burden, without compromising the validity or reliability of the assessment outcomes. It necessitates pilot testing of proposed changes, gathering feedback from stakeholders, assessors, candidates, and administrators, and conducting a thorough review of the impact on assessment quality and fairness. This aligns with principles of good governance and continuous improvement, ensuring that any optimization efforts are evidence-based and contribute positively to the overall effectiveness of the AON assessment. Ethical considerations are paramount, ensuring that no candidate is disadvantaged by the optimization process. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on reducing the number of assessment stages without a corresponding evaluation of their impact on assessment validity would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a superficial assessment, failing to identify critical competencies or potential risks, thereby violating the ethical duty to conduct thorough and accurate evaluations. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing changes based on anecdotal evidence or personal preference, without objective data or stakeholder consultation, risks introducing bias and undermining the credibility of the assessment. This disregards the need for a robust and defensible assessment methodology, potentially leading to regulatory breaches if the assessment is found to be discriminatory or ineffective. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes cost savings above all else, even if it means compromising the quality of assessment tools or the training of assessors, would be ethically unsound. This could result in a flawed assessment process that fails to meet its intended purpose and could expose the organization to reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny. The professional decision-making process for similar situation should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the problem or opportunity for optimization and its desired outcomes. Second, identify all relevant stakeholders and their perspectives. Third, research and propose potential solutions, evaluating each against established criteria for validity, reliability, fairness, efficiency, and regulatory compliance. Fourth, conduct pilot testing and gather data to assess the impact of proposed changes. Fifth, implement changes incrementally and monitor their effectiveness. Finally, establish a feedback loop for continuous improvement. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with professional and ethical standards. Question 5. Performance analysis shows a significant positive trend in a particular asset class, which aligns with the stated investment objectives. A major stakeholder, who holds a substantial portion of the fund, has requested that the AON assessment for this asset class be adjusted to reflect a more aggressive weighting, citing their personal financial goals. How should the investment manager proceed with the AON assessment? Option A. Exclude the asset class from the AON assessment entirely, as its performance might be perceived as overly influenced by the stakeholder's request. Option B. Immediately adjust the AON assessment weighting to favor the asset class as requested by the stakeholder to maintain positive stakeholder relations. Option C. Conduct the AON assessment strictly according to the predefined methodology and objective criteria, while acknowledging the stakeholders' input and explaining the adherence to the established process. Option D. Focus the AON assessment solely on the historical performance data that best supports the stakeholders' desired outcome, disregarding other relevant factors. The correct answer is C. Conduct the AON assessment strictly according to the predefined methodology and objective criteria, while acknowledging the stakeholders' input and explaining the adherence to the established process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial interests of a key stakeholder with the long-term fiduciary duty owed to all beneficiaries. The stakeholder's direct request, while seemingly beneficial in the short term, could introduce conflicts of interest and potentially compromise the integrity of the AON assessment process. Careful judgment is required to ensure the assessment remains objective, fair, and aligned with the overarching investment objectives and regulatory requirements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves acknowledging the stakeholders' input while firmly adhering to the established AON assessment methodology. This upholds the fiduciary duty by ensuring that the assessment is conducted impartially, based on objective criteria, and without undue influence. It demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the integrity of the assessment process and protecting the interests of all beneficiaries, aligning with regulatory expectations for transparency and fairness in investment management. Correct approach is analysis. An approach that prioritizes the stakeholders' immediate financial gain by directly altering the assessment criteria or weighting would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be construed as a breach of fiduciary duty, potentially leading to misrepresentation of the investment's true performance and exposing the firm to regulatory sanctions for unfair dealing and conflicts of interest. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the stakeholders' concerns entirely without proper consideration or explanation. While maintaining objectivity is crucial, a complete disregard for stakeholder feedback can erode trust and may indicate a failure to adequately engage with important parties, potentially leading to reputational damage and a perception of poor governance. Finally, an approach that involves selectively presenting data or framing the assessment in a way that solely supports the stakeholders' desired outcome, even if technically accurate in isolation, would be ethically unsound. This could be seen as misleading or manipulative, violating principles of transparency and fair representation expected in financial assessments. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the core objective of the AON assessment and the regulatory obligations governing it. This involves identifying potential conflicts of interest early on. The next step is to evaluate any stakeholder input against the established assessment criteria and the firm's fiduciary responsibilities. If input conflicts with these principles, the professional must communicate the rationale for adhering to the established process, explaining how it serves the best interests of all beneficiaries. Transparency and documentation of all decisions and communications are paramount. Question 6. Strategic planning requires a thorough review and enhancement of the AON assessment process to ensure both efficiency and effectiveness. Which of the following approaches best aligns with best professional practice and regulatory expectations for process optimization in this context? Option A. Immediately implement a new, advanced assessment software package, assuming it will inherently streamline the process and reduce costs, without extensive user training or integration planning. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive audit of the current AON assessment workflow, identifying specific bottlenecks and areas for improvement, and then pilot test technology-driven solutions and revised methodologies with input from the assessment team and compliance officers. Option C. Focus on significantly reducing the time senior analysts spend on each assessment by reassigning tasks to junior staff, aiming for a higher volume of assessments within the same time frame. Option D. Prioritize cost reduction by limiting the number of external data sources and third-party verification steps used in the AON assessment, even if it means a narrower scope of review. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive audit of the current AON assessment workflow, identifying specific bottlenecks and areas for improvement, and then pilot test technology-driven solutions and revised methodologies with input from the assessment team and compliance officers. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in process optimization, where a firm is seeking to enhance its AON assessment procedures. Difficulty lies in balancing the need for efficiency and cost reduction with the imperative to maintain the integrity and effectiveness of the assessment process, ensuring compliance with regulatory standards and ethical obligations. Overly aggressive cost-cutting can compromise the quality of analysis, leading to potential regulatory breaches and reputational damage. Conversely, a failure to optimize can result in competitive disadvantage and inefficient resource allocation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a systematic, data-driven review of the existing AON assessment process. This involves identifying bottlenecks, inefficiencies, and areas where technology or revised methodologies can improve accuracy and speed without compromising quality. It prioritizes stakeholder engagement, including the assessment team and relevant compliance officers, to ensure buy-in and practical implementation. This aligns with regulatory expectations for robust and effective risk management frameworks, which require continuous improvement and adaptation. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to providing a high-quality service while managing resources responsibly. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on reducing the time spent by senior personnel on assessments, without a corresponding analysis of how this time reduction impacts the depth and accuracy of the assessment. This could lead to superficial reviews, missed risks, and non-compliance with regulatory requirements for thorough due diligence. It fails to acknowledge that the value of senior personnel lies in their expertise, which cannot be simply substituted by junior staff or technology without proper oversight and integration. Another incorrect approach involves implementing new assessment software without adequate training or integration into existing workflows. This can lead to user error, data integrity issues, and ultimately, a less effective assessment process. It bypasses the crucial step of understanding how technology can augment, rather than simply replace, human judgment and expertise, potentially leading to regulatory noncompliance due to flawed data or incomplete assessments. A third incorrect approach prioritizes the reduction of external data sources to cut costs, without a thorough risk assessment of the impact on the comprehensiveness of the AON assessment. This could result in a narrower scope of review, potentially overlooking critical risk factors and failing to meet regulatory standards for due diligence and risk identification. It prioritizes cost savings over the fundamental requirement of a comprehensive and accurate assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach process optimization by first understanding the current state, identifying specific pain points and inefficiencies, and then exploring solutions that demonstrably improve outcomes or efficiency without compromising regulatory compliance or ethical standards. This involves a phased approach: analysis, solution design, pilot testing, implementation, and ongoing monitoring. Stakeholder consultation and a clear understanding of regulatory expectations are paramount throughout the process. Question 7. To address the challenge of improving the efficiency of the AON assessment process while maintaining its integrity and effectiveness, which of the following strategies would best align with regulatory expectations for a robust and reliable assessment framework? Option A. Conduct a detailed analysis of current AON assessment workflows to identify specific areas of delay or redundancy, gather data on the impact of these inefficiencies, and then implement targeted, evidence-based improvements with stakeholder validation. Option B. Rely on the subjective feedback of experienced assessors to identify and implement changes to the AON assessment process, prioritizing those changes that seem most likely to save time. Option C. Implement a new, automated AON assessment tool across all departments immediately to expedite the process, assuming it will inherently improve efficiency without prior testing or staff training. Option D. Focus on reducing the time allocated for each AON assessment by setting strict time limits for assessors, with the primary goal of increasing the volume of assessments completed per day. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed analysis of current AON assessment workflows to identify specific areas of delay or redundancy, gather data on the impact of these inefficiencies, and then implement targeted, evidence-based improvements with stakeholder validation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing efficiency gains with the fundamental duty to ensure the AON assessment process remains robust, fair, and compliant with regulatory expectations. The pressure to optimize can lead to shortcuts that inadvertently compromise data integrity or the thoroughness of the assessment, potentially impacting client outcomes and regulatory standing. Careful judgment is required to identify improvements that enhance efficiency without sacrificing the quality and reliability of the AON assessment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven review of the existing AON assessment process. This involves identifying specific bottlenecks or inefficiencies through objective measurement and analysis. Implementing targeted improvements based on this evidence ensures that changes are meaningful and address actual issues. Furthermore, involving relevant stakeholders in the review and validation process fosters buy-in and ensures that the optimized process remains practical and effective in real-world application. This aligns with the regulatory expectation of maintaining a sound and effective assessment framework, demonstrating due diligence and a commitment to continuous improvement that benefits clients and the firm. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on reducing the time spent on each AON assessment, without a corresponding analysis of its impact on the depth and accuracy of the information gathered, would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a superficial assessment, failing to identify crucial risks or client needs, thereby breaching the duty of care and potentially violating regulatory requirements for thoroughness. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing new technology without adequate testing or training for staff would be problematic. This could introduce errors, create new inefficiencies, and undermine the reliability of the AON assessment, exposing the firm to operational and regulatory risks. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal opinions to drive process changes, rather than objective data, risks implementing changes that are not effective or even detrimental to the assessment's quality. This demonstrates a lack of professional rigor and a failure to adhere to best practices in process management. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of process optimization. This should be followed by a comprehensive diagnostic phase to understand the current state, identify pain points, and gather objective data. Potential solutions should then be evaluated against predefined criteria, including efficiency, effectiveness, compliance, and client impact. Pilot testing and stakeholder feedback are crucial before full implementation. Finally, ongoing monitoring and evaluation are necessary to ensure sustained benefits and to identify further opportunities for refinement. Question 8. Analysis of a financial advisory firm's initiative to implement a new automated client onboarding and portfolio rebalancing system to improve operational efficiency. The firm is considering a full rollout without extensive client pre-testing or a phased integration, aiming to achieve cost savings and faster processing times immediately. Which approach to process optimization best aligns with regulatory expectations for client best interests and suitability? Option A. A phased implementation of the automated system, starting with a pilot group of clients, coupled with ongoing monitoring of client outcomes and a clear process for human advisor intervention in complex cases. Option B. Focusing solely on the technological aspects of automation, assuming that increased efficiency will inherently lead to better client outcomes and regulatory compliance. Option C. Immediate and complete deployment of the automated system across all client segments, prioritizing speed and cost reduction to maximize efficiency gains from day one. Option D. Implementing the automated system primarily for back-office functions, while maintaining manual client interaction and decision-making for all front-facing advisory services. The correct answer is A. A phased implementation of the automated system, starting with a pilot group of clients, coupled with ongoing monitoring of client outcomes and a clear process for human advisor intervention in complex cases. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in process optimization within financial advisory firms, balancing the efficiency gains of automation with the regulatory requirement for personalized client service and robust risk management. The professional challenge lies in identifying the optimal point where technology enhances, rather than compromises, client outcomes and compliance. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any process optimization, particularly involving automated advice or client interaction, adheres strictly to the principles of suitability, client best interests, and data protection as mandated by the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a phased, client-centric implementation of process optimization. This involves thorough testing of automated tools to ensure accuracy and suitability, followed by a clear communication strategy to clients about the changes and their implications. Crucially, it maintains human oversight for complex cases and provides clear escalation paths, aligning with the regulatory expectation that technology should augment, not replace, professional judgment and client relationships. This approach ensures that efficiency is pursued without sacrificing regulatory compliance, ethical obligations, or client trust. An incorrect approach that relies solely on rapid, unverified automation without client consultation or human oversight fails to meet regulatory standards. This could lead to breaches of suitability rules, as automated advice may not adequately capture individual client circumstances, risk appetites, or financial goals. It also risks violating data protection regulations if client data is not handled with appropriate security and consent during the automated processes. Furthermore, a lack of human oversight can result in a failure to identify and mitigate potential conflicts of interest or to provide the nuanced advice expected by clients, thereby undermining the firm's fiduciary duty. Another incorrect approach that focuses on cost reduction through automation without considering the impact on service quality or regulatory adherence is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to a decline in client satisfaction and potentially expose the firm to regulatory scrutiny for providing a substandard service. It demonstrates a failure to prioritize client best interests, a core ethical and regulatory principle. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of proposed process changes against regulatory requirements, ethical obligations, and client impact. This includes conducting a thorough risk assessment, seeking client feedback, ensuring adequate training for staff, and establishing clear governance and oversight mechanisms. Professionals must always ask, does this change genuinely benefit the client? Does it uphold our regulatory obligations? Is there sufficient human oversight to manage potential risks? Question 9. Quality control measures reveal that a financial advisor, after completing the AON assessment, is recommending a complex investment product to a long-standing client. The client has expressed a desire for stable, predictable returns and has a low tolerance for risk. The advisor, however, is aware that this product offers a higher commission for them. The advisor is considering framing the recommendation in a way that emphasizes potential upside while downplaying the inherent risks and the product's complexity, believing this will be more palatable to the client and ensure continued business. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional and regulatory expectations following the AON assessment? Option A. Proceed with the recommendation of the complex product, focusing the client conversation on the potential for higher returns and the advisor's expertise in managing such investments, while gently steering the conversation away from detailed risk disclosures. Option B. Recommend a simpler, lower commission product that more closely aligns with the client's stated risk tolerance and desire for stable returns, even if it means a lower immediate financial benefit for the advisor. Option C. Advise the client that the complex product is the only way to achieve their desired growth, omitting details about the associated risks and the advisor's commission structure to avoid overwhelming the client. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the client's stated risk tolerance and financial goals. Objectively assess the suitability of the complex product against these criteria, and present a balanced recommendation that clearly outlines both the potential benefits and significant risks, including alternatives. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the client's stated risk tolerance and financial goals. Objectively assess the suitability of the complex product against these criteria, and present a balanced recommendation that clearly outlines both the potential benefits and significant risks, including alternatives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for client satisfaction with the long-term integrity of financial advice and regulatory compliance. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure that recommendations are truly in the client's best interest, not merely driven by the advisor's personal incentives or a desire to avoid difficult conversations. The AON assessment, in this context, is designed to evaluate the advisor's ability to uphold these principles. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective assessment of the client's situation and needs, aligning with the core principles of fiduciary duty and client-centric advice. This involves a comprehensive review of the client's financial goals, risk tolerance, and existing portfolio, followed by a recommendation that demonstrably serves those interests. This aligns with regulatory expectations that financial advice must be suitable and in the client's best interest, avoiding any undue influence or misrepresentation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on client retention without a deep dive into suitability fails to meet regulatory obligations. It risks providing advice that is not appropriate for the client's circumstances, potentially leading to financial harm and regulatory breaches related to suitability and best interest requirements. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the advisor's commission structure over objective advice directly violates ethical codes and regulatory mandates against conflicts of interest and mis-selling. This demonstrates a failure to act in the client's best interest. A third incorrect approach that avoids discussing potential downsides or alternative strategies to maintain client comfort, while seemingly client-friendly, is a failure of transparency and professional duty. It prevents the client from making fully informed decisions and can lead to a false sense of security, ultimately harming the client if adverse market events occur or if a more suitable strategy was overlooked. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the client's objectives and constraints. This is followed by an objective evaluation of available options, considering all relevant factors including risk, return, and costs. Transparency with the client about all aspects of the recommendation, including potential risks and alternatives, is paramount. Finally, the professional must ensure that the chosen course of action is demonstrably in the client's best interest and compliant with all applicable regulations. Question 10. Process analysis reveals that a client, during their AON assessment, expresses a strong preference for a specific, high-risk asset class that has recently experienced significant volatility, citing a recent news article as their primary source of information. The advisor has identified that this asset class does not align with the client's stated long-term financial goals and risk tolerance as determined by the initial assessment. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response? Option A. Immediately proceed with investing in the client's preferred asset class as requested to ensure client satisfaction and maintain a positive relationship, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks. Option B. Inform the client that their preferred asset class is unsuitable and immediately recommend a completely different, conservative investment strategy without further discussion of their preference. Option C. Acknowledge the client's interest, explain the potential risks and volatility associated with the preferred asset class, and present alternative investment strategies that better align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, while also exploring the client's underlying reasons for their preference. Option D. Invest a small portion of the client's portfolio in the preferred asset class to appease them, while allocating the majority to a more suitable strategy, without fully disclosing the potential implications of the small allocation. The correct answer is C. Acknowledge the client's interest, explain the potential risks and volatility associated with the preferred asset class, and present alternative investment strategies that better align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, while also exploring the client's underlying reasons for their preference. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference for a particular investment strategy and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, especially when that preference may not align with optimal risk management or long-term financial goals. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional attachment to a specific asset class while upholding their professional obligations under the AON assessment framework, which emphasizes suitability and client welfare. The challenge lies in providing objective advice without alienating the client or appearing dismissive of their input. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a thorough, objective assessment of the client's overall financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives before making any recommendations. This aligns with the core principles of the AON assessment, which mandates a comprehensive understanding of the client's circumstances to ensure that any proposed investment strategy is suitable and in their best interest. By seeking to understand the underlying reasons for the client's preference and then presenting a balanced view of alternatives, the advisor fulfills their fiduciary duty and upholds ethical standards. This approach emphasizes informed consent and client education, empowering the client to make decisions based on a complete picture. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately capitulating to the client's request without further investigation. This fails to meet the AON assessment's requirement for a suitability analysis and breaches the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. It prioritizes client satisfaction over sound financial advice, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal returns. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's preference outright and forcefully advocate for a different strategy without adequately explaining the rationale or acknowledging the client's perspective. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and professional communication, potentially damaging the client relationship and failing to build trust. It also neglects the importance of understanding the client's motivations, which could reveal underlying concerns that need to be addressed. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's preferred strategy while downplaying its associated risks or potential downsides. This is a form of misrepresentation and a failure to provide complete and accurate information, which is a fundamental ethical and regulatory requirement. It undermines the principle of informed decision-making and can lead to significant client dissatisfaction and potential financial harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with active listening and information gathering. This involves understanding the client's stated preferences, their underlying motivations, and their overall financial context. Following this, a comprehensive assessment of suitability, risk, and objectives should be conducted, drawing upon the principles of the AON assessment. Recommendations should then be presented clearly, with a balanced discussion of pros and cons, and tailored to the client's individual circumstances. The process should always prioritize the client's best interests, even when it means gently challenging their initial preferences with well-reasoned, evidence-based advice. Question 11. What factors determine the appropriate scope and depth of information gathering during the AON assessment process from a stakeholder perspective, considering both client needs and regulatory compliance? Option A. The advisor's personal experience with similar clients and the perceived urgency of the client's request. Option B. The complexity of the client's financial situation, their stated objectives, and the specific regulatory requirements for suitability and disclosure as outlined in the AON assessment framework. Option C. The client's stated immediate financial goals and the advisor's understanding of the firm's product offerings. Option D. The potential for generating commission revenue and the ease with which the client can provide information. The correct answer is C. The client's stated immediate financial goals and the advisor's understanding of the firm's product offerings. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate financial needs of a client with the long-term sustainability and ethical obligations of the financial advisory firm. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts of interest, ensure compliance with regulatory requirements regarding client suitability and disclosure, and uphold their fiduciary duty. The pressure to meet sales targets or retain a client can cloud judgment, making a structured, principle-based approach essential. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's best interests and adheres strictly to the AON assessment framework. This involves a thorough, objective evaluation of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives, ensuring that any recommended course of action is demonstrably suitable and aligned with regulatory expectations for client care and advice. It emphasizes transparency and informed consent, which are cornerstones of ethical financial advisory. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated immediate desire without a comprehensive assessment fails to meet the regulatory standard of care. This could lead to unsuitable recommendations, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating principles of prudence and diligence. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes firm profitability or sales targets over client suitability would represent a clear breach of fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations, potentially leading to significant penalties and reputational damage. An approach that relies on superficial questioning or assumptions about the client's needs, rather than a deep, evidence-based assessment, also fails to meet professional standards and could result in misaligned advice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements of the AON assessment. This should be followed by a systematic data-gathering process to understand the client's complete financial picture, risk profile, and stated goals. Crucially, this information must be analyzed objectively to determine suitability, with all recommendations clearly documented and explained to the client, ensuring they can make an informed decision. Regular review and adherence to ethical codes of conduct should be integrated throughout the process. Question 12. The monitoring system demonstrates a critical reliance on a single vendor's proprietary technology, raising concerns about potential obsolescence and lack of integration with newer compliance tools. From a stakeholder perspective, which of the following actions best addresses this situation while adhering to regulatory expectations for robust risk management? Option A. Immediately procure an upgrade for the existing proprietary system to ensure it meets the latest functional specifications, deferring any broader architectural considerations until after the upgrade is complete. Option B. Lobby for a reduction in the frequency of monitoring activities to lessen the burden on the current system and mitigate the perceived risk of failure. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive review of the entire monitoring framework, including its technological architecture, data flows, and alignment with current and anticipated regulatory requirements, to identify strategic improvements and potential vendor diversification. Option D. Focus solely on negotiating a more favorable long-term contract with the current vendor, assuming their technology will continue to meet future needs without further investigation. The correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive review of the entire monitoring framework, including its technological architecture, data flows, and alignment with current and anticipated regulatory requirements, to identify strategic improvements and potential vendor diversification. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for operational efficiency with the long-term imperative of robust risk management and regulatory compliance. The firm's reliance on a single, potentially outdated, monitoring system creates a single point of failure, which is inherently risky. The challenge lies in identifying and addressing this systemic weakness without causing undue disruption to ongoing business activities. Careful judgment is required to assess the true extent of the risk and to propose solutions that are both effective and proportionate. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, forward-looking strategy. By advocating for a review of the entire monitoring framework, including its integration with other risk management processes and its alignment with evolving regulatory expectations, it addresses the root cause of the potential vulnerability. This proactive stance ensures that the firm is not just patching a symptom, but is building a more resilient and compliant operational infrastructure. This aligns with the principles of good governance and risk management, which are fundamental to maintaining client trust and regulatory standing. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate system upgrades without considering the broader context fails to address potential systemic issues. This could lead to a situation where the upgraded system is still not optimally integrated or fails to meet future regulatory requirements, necessitating further costly interventions. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost savings over thorough risk assessment would be a direct contravention of regulatory duties to maintain adequate controls and manage risks effectively. This demonstrates a disregard for the potential financial and reputational damage that could arise from inadequate monitoring. A third incorrect approach that delays action due to perceived operational inconvenience ignores the principle of timely risk mitigation, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance. The longer a known risk persists, the greater the potential for regulatory sanctions and client harm. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk identification and assessment. This involves understanding the potential impact of the identified weakness on clients, the firm, and the market. Following this, a comprehensive evaluation of potential solutions should be undertaken, considering their effectiveness, cost, feasibility, and regulatory implications. The chosen solution should then be implemented with clear communication and oversight, followed by ongoing monitoring to ensure its continued effectiveness. This iterative process ensures that risk management is an ongoing activity, not a one-off event. Question 13. Regulatory review indicates that client has requested a detailed breakdown of the findings from their recent AON assessment, specifically asking for preliminary interpretations of certain risk indicators that are still undergoing internal validation. The professional responsible for the client relationship has access to the raw data and initial observations from the assessment, but is aware that the final, proved report is not yet complete and may contain nuanced adjustments to these preliminary interpretations. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and professional best practices for handling this client request? Option A. Advise the client that the AON assessment findings are confidential and cannot be shared in any form until the final report is officially released by the assessment body. Option B. Immediately provide the client with the preliminary interpretations of the risk indicators, explaining that these are subject to change in the final report. Option C. Forward the client's request to the compliance department and await their explicit instructions on how to proceed, without any initial communication to the client. Option D. Inform the client that the final AON assessment report is still being finalized and will be provided in its entirety once complete, while offering to discuss the general scope and purpose of the assessment in the interim. The correct answer is D. Inform the client that the final AON assessment report is still being finalized and will be provided in its entirety once complete, while offering to discuss the general scope and purpose of the assessment in the interim. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance competing demands: the need to provide accurate and timely information to a client versus the obligation to adhere to internal compliance procedures and regulatory guidelines. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the scope of the AON assessment and determining the appropriate level of detail and format for client communication, especially when the client is seeking information that might be sensitive or require specific internal validation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, compliant, and client-centric method for information dissemination. By first consulting internal compliance and the designated AON assessment framework, the professional ensures that any information shared is accurate, authorized, and aligns with regulatory requirements. This proactive step mitigates the risk of miscommunication, regulatory breaches, or sharing information that is not yet finalized or approved. It demonstrates a commitment to both client service and regulatory adherence, fostering trust and maintaining the integrity of the assessment process. An incorrect approach that involves immediately providing the client with preliminary or unverified data from the AON assessment would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to the client making decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information, potentially causing financial harm or reputational damage. Furthermore, it bypasses established internal controls designed to ensure the quality and accuracy of assessments, which is a breach of professional duty and potentially a violation of the specific AON assessment guidelines. Another incorrect approach, such as delaying the response indefinitely without any communication, fails to meet client expectations and can be perceived as unprofessional and unhelpful, potentially damaging the client relationship. It also neglects the professional obligation to manage client inquiries effectively and within reasonable timeframes, even if the full answer requires further internal processing. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's request and its context. This should be followed by an assessment of the information required and the internal processes and regulatory frameworks governing its provision. The framework should then involve identifying the appropriate internal stakeholders or departments for consultation, e.g., compliance, legal, or the specific team responsible for the AON assessment. Finally, the professional should communicate a clear plan to the client, outlining the steps being taken to address their request and providing an estimated timeline for a comprehensive response, ensuring transparency and managing expectations throughout the process. Question 14. Cost-benefit analysis shows that streamlining the AON assessment process could yield significant cost savings for the firm. However, the firm's compliance department has raised concerns that any reduction in the current assessment's rigor might compromise its effectiveness in ensuring client suitability. Considering the firm's regulatory obligations and ethical duties, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Outsource the AON assessment to a third-party provider that offers a cheaper, less comprehensive service without an independent review of the provider's suitability and the impact on the firm's regulatory responsibilities. Option B. Implement a revised AON assessment process that maintains its core suitability objectives but utilizes more efficient data gathering methods, subject to rigorous testing and compliance review, ensuring no compromise on client understanding and risk profiling. Option C. Proceed with a significant reduction in the AON assessment scope and frequency to achieve immediate cost savings, assuming that clients will not be negatively impacted by less detailed information. Option D. Temporarily suspend the AON assessment for all new clients until the firm's financial situation improves, relying on existing client data for ongoing advice. Correct answer is B. Implement a revised AON assessment process that maintains its core suitability objectives but utilizes more efficient data gathering methods, subject to rigorous testing and compliance review, ensuring no compromise on client understanding and risk profiling. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing immediate financial pressures with long-term client interests and regulatory compliance. The firm is experiencing a downturn, creating pressure to reduce costs. However, the AON assessment, a critical tool for understanding client needs and suitability, is being questioned as a potential area for cost-cutting. The challenge lies in discerning whether reducing the scope or frequency of the AON assessment is a prudent cost-saving measure or a breach of professional duty and regulatory requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's best interests and adherence to regulatory obligations over short-term financial expediency. The AON assessment, as mandated by relevant regulations, e.g., FCA's Conduct of Business Sourcebook in the UK, or similar provisions in other jurisdictions if specified, is designed to ensure that financial advice and product recommendations are suitable for the client. Diluting this process, even for cost-saving reasons, risks providing unsuitable advice, leading to client detriment, regulatory sanctions, and reputational damage. Maintaining the integrity of the AON assessment process is a fundamental ethical and regulatory requirement. An incorrect approach that involves significantly reducing the depth or frequency of the AON assessment without a clear, documented, and justifiable rationale based on a thorough understanding of the client's evolving circumstances would be a regulatory and ethical failure. This could be seen as a failure to act with due skill, care, and diligence, and a failure to treat customers fairly. Specifically, if the reduction leads to advice that is not suitable for the client's objectives, risk tolerance, or financial situation, it directly contravenes the spirit and letter of regulations designed to protect consumers. Another incorrect approach might be to delegate the AON assessment to less qualified staff without adequate oversight, which compromises the quality of the assessment and potentially leads to errors or omissions. Again, failing to meet regulatory standards for competence and supervision. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue, the tension between cost reduction and client protection/regulatory compliance. This involves consulting the relevant regulatory handbook and internal policies regarding client assessments. The next step is to evaluate the potential impact of any proposed change on client outcomes and regulatory standing. If cost savings are deemed necessary, the firm must explore alternatives that do not compromise client suitability assessments. This might include operational efficiencies elsewhere, renegotiating supplier contracts, or seeking new revenue streams. If modifications to the AON assessment are considered, they must be demonstrably justified by a change in client circumstances or a proven, evidence-based enhancement of the assessment process that maintains or improves its effectiveness, while potentially reducing cost, and crucially, must be approved by senior management and potentially require regulatory notification or approval depending on the jurisdiction. Question 15. The risk matrix shows a proposed investment falls into a high-risk category, yet the client has verbally indicated a moderate risk tolerance. The AON assessment process requires a thorough evaluation of this discrepancy. Which of the following actions best aligns with the AON assessment framework and professional best practice? Option A. Decline the investment immediately without further discussion, as the client's stated tolerance does not match the high-risk category indicated by the matrix. Option B. Document the client's stated moderate risk tolerance and the investment's high-risk profile, then schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss the discrepancy and ensure the client fully understands the implications before proceeding. Option C. Proceed with the investment after obtaining the client's verbal agreement, assuming their stated tolerance is accurate for this specific opportunity. Option D. Override the risk matrix assessment, deeming it overly cautious, and proceed with the investment based on the client's verbal indication of moderate risk tolerance. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the investment after obtaining the client's verbal agreement, assuming their stated tolerance is accurate for this specific opportunity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the client's stated risk tolerance with the objective assessment of risk presented by the investment. The firm's internal AON assessment framework, designed to ensure suitability and prevent misrepresentation, mandates a structured approach to reconcile these potentially conflicting elements. The challenge lies in not simply accepting the client's self-assessment at face value, but in critically evaluating it against the investment's characteristics and the client's broader financial situation, as guided by the AON assessment process. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the AON assessment framework's requirement for a comprehensive evaluation. This involves not only documenting the client's stated risk tolerance, but also cross-referencing it with the investment's risk profile as depicted in the risk matrix. Crucially, it necessitates a discussion with the client to ensure their understanding of the investment's risks and to confirm that their stated tolerance aligns with the reality of the proposed investment. This proactive engagement and documented verification are fundamental to fulfilling the firm's duty of care and regulatory obligations under the AON assessment guidelines, which aim to prevent unsuitable recommendations and protect clients from undue risk. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the client's verbal confirmation without further investigation fails to meet the AON assessment standards. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it bypasses the due diligence required to ensure suitability. The firm would be acting on an assumption rather than a verified understanding, potentially exposing the client to risks they do not fully comprehend or cannot reasonably bear. Another incorrect approach, which prioritizes closing the sale over a thorough risk assessment, represents a clear breach of ethical conduct and regulatory requirements. This prioritizes commercial interests above client welfare, a direct contravention of the principles underpinning the AON assessment framework. Finally, an approach that dismisses the risk matrix as an overly conservative tool without a valid, documented rationale also fails to adhere to the AON assessment's structured methodology. This demonstrates a disregard for the firm's internal controls and the objective risk assessment process. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic application of the AON assessment framework. This begins with gathering all relevant information, including client profiles and investment characteristics. Next, the framework's tools, such as the risk matrix, must be utilized to objectively assess risk. The core of the process, then, involves reconciling the client's stated preferences with the objective risk assessment, engaging in transparent communication with the client to ensure mutual understanding and informed consent. Finally, all steps and decisions must be meticulously documented to demonstrate compliance and provide a clear audit trail. Question 16. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of retail investors are increasingly influenced by social media trends and peer recommendations when making investment decisions. You are advising a client who, after reading a popular online forum, wishes to invest a substantial portion of their portfolio into a highly speculative, unproven technology stock. The client expresses strong conviction based on the forum's sentiment, despite your firm's internal risk assessment flagging the stock as extremely high risk and lacking fundamental valuation metrics. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Explain to the client the risks associated with speculative investments, the limitations of social media-driven investment decisions, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, while respecting their ultimate decision after thorough discussion. Option B. Inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled due to the speculative nature of the stock and the firm's policy against investing in such assets, without further discussion or exploration of alternatives. Option C. Immediately execute the client's requested trade to avoid losing their business, as the client is clearly determined to invest in this stock regardless of your advice. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their stated conviction and the perceived market sentiment from the online forum indicate a potential for significant short-term gains, which aligns with their desire for aggressive growth. Correct answer is A. Explain to the client the risks associated with speculative investments, the limitations of social media-driven investment decisions, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their stated financial goals and risk tolerance, while respecting their ultimate decision after thorough discussion. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory, balancing client needs with regulatory obligations and the firm's internal policies. The professional challenge lies in discerning when a client's stated preference, driven by immediate market sentiment or personal bias, might conflict with their long-term financial well-being and the advisor's fiduciary duty. This requires a nuanced application of the decision-making framework, moving beyond a simple transactional approach to one that prioritizes informed client consent and suitability. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres to the core principles of client-centric advice and regulatory compliance. It involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then educating the client on the potential implications of their request. This aligns with the regulatory expectation that advisors act in the best interests of their clients, ensuring that investment decisions are suitable and well understood. Ethical considerations also dictate that advisors do not simply accede to client demands if those demands are demonstrably not in the client's best interest, or if they expose the client to undue risk without proper understanding. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate request without adequate due diligence would represent a failure to uphold the advisor's duty of care and suitability obligations. This could lead to investments that are not aligned with the client's long-term goals, potentially resulting in financial harm and regulatory breaches. Another incorrect approach, such as dismissing the client's request outright without proper explanation or consideration, could damage the client relationship and fail to address the underlying reasons for the client's interest, potentially leading to the client seeking advice elsewhere from less scrupulous sources. A third incorrect approach, which prioritizes the firm's revenue generation over client suitability, is a clear violation of fiduciary duty and regulatory mandates designed to protect investors. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's request and its context. This should be followed by an assessment of the request against the client's established financial profile and objectives. The next step involves identifying any potential conflicts or risks. Subsequently, the professional should communicate these findings clearly and transparently to the client, offering alternative solutions or explanations where necessary. The final step is to ensure the client makes an informed decision, with the advisor documenting the rationale and the client's consent. This iterative process ensures that advice is both compliant and ethically sound. Question 17. The assessment process reveals a discrepancy in the client's stated risk tolerance compared to their investment portfolio's actual risk profile, raising questions about the suitability of current holdings. Option A. Inform the client that their portfolio is misaligned and suggest they accept the current holdings as is, as adjustments are too complex. Option B. Immediately recommend liquidating all assets deemed to be outside the stated risk tolerance to mitigate potential losses. Option C. Initiate a detailed review of the client's investment portfolio and risk tolerance documentation, seeking further clarification from the client on their understanding and comfort level with the current investment strategy. Option D. Report the discrepancy to the compliance department without any initial attempt to understand the client's perspective or the specifics of the assessment findings. The correct answer is C. Initiate a detailed review of the client's investment portfolio and risk tolerance documentation, seeking further clarification from the client on their understanding and comfort level with the current investment strategy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the assessment process has uncovered information that could significantly impact the client's financial well-being and the advisor's professional standing. Advisor must navigate conflicting priorities, fulfilling their duty of care to the client, adhering to regulatory requirements, and maintaining professional integrity. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the discovered information within the context of the AON assessment framework and deciding on the appropriate course of action without causing undue alarm or making assumptions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective, and client-centric review. By seeking clarification and additional information directly related to the assessment's findings, the advisor demonstrates a commitment to understanding the full picture before making any recommendations. This aligns with the regulatory expectation of acting in the client's best interest and conducting a comprehensive assessment. It also upholds ethical principles of diligence and transparency. The advisor is not making premature judgments, but rather engaging in a structured problem-solving process, which is fundamental to responsible financial advice. An incorrect approach that involves immediately escalating the issue to senior management without first attempting to understand the nuances of the assessment findings would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to unnecessary panic or misinterpretation of the situation, potentially damaging the client relationship and the firm's reputation. Bypasses the advisor's primary responsibility to investigate and understand the client's circumstances. Another incorrect approach, such as downplaying the findings or ignoring them to avoid difficult conversations, represents a failure in the duty of care and a potential breach of regulatory obligations. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the client's financial safety, which could have severe consequences. Furthermore, making assumptions about the client's intent or the severity of the findings without concrete evidence is a significant ethical and regulatory failure, as it deviates from an objective and evidence-based decision-making process. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when faced with such situations. This framework typically involves 1. Information gathering and verification, ensuring all relevant data is collected and validated. 2. Assessment and analysis, objectively evaluating the information against established criteria and regulatory guidelines. 3. Identification of options, brainstorming potential courses of action. 4. Evaluation of options, assessing the risks, benefits, and regulatory implications of each option. 5. Decision and action, selecting the most appropriate course of action based on the analysis. 6. Review and follow-up, monitoring the outcome and making adjustments as needed. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-informed, defensible, and aligned with professional standards. Question 18. Operational review demonstrates that a key client's account activity has consistently deviated from the firm's established risk parameters for a specific product, without prior authorization or documented risk assessment. While no immediate financial loss has occurred, the pattern suggests a potential systemic issue with the client's trading strategy or the firm's oversight. The firm's policy clearly states that such deviations require pre-approval and a formal risk assessment. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the responsible individual? Option A. Immediately inform the client that their account activity is in breach of firm policy and that further trading will be suspended until compliance is achieved. Option B. Advise the client that while the activity is outside the standard parameters, it has not resulted in any losses, and therefore no further action is required at this time. Option C. Proceed with seeking retrospective approval for the client's past trading activity, focusing on justifying the commercial benefits of retaining the client. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive review of the client's account activity to understand the root cause of the deviations, consult with the compliance department to assess the regulatory implications, and then propose a course of action to senior management based on the findings and the firm's risk appetite. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive review of the client's account activity to understand the root cause of the deviations, consult with the compliance department to assess the regulatory implications, and then propose a course of action to senior management based on the findings and the firm's risk appetite. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's established risk appetite and the potential for significant client revenue. The operational review has identified a deviation from policy, which, while not immediately resulting in a loss, indicates a potential vulnerability. The challenge lies in balancing the need to maintain regulatory compliance and internal control integrity against the commercial imperative to retain a valuable client relationship. A hasty decision could either alienate the client and incur reputational damage or, conversely, compromise the firm's risk management framework, potentially leading to future, more severe issues. Careful judgment is required to assess the true level of risk and determine an appropriate, compliant response. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, risk-based assessment that prioritizes adherence to the firm's established policies and regulatory obligations. This begins with a thorough investigation to understand the root cause of the deviation and the actual level of risk introduced. Following this, a consultative process with relevant stakeholders, including compliance and senior management, is essential. The ultimate decision should be guided by the firm's documented risk appetite statement and relevant regulatory guidance. This approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to robust governance, proactive risk management, and regulatory compliance. It ensures that decisions are not made in isolation, but are informed by established frameworks and expert advice, thereby protecting both the firm and its clients from undue risk. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the duty of care expected of financial professionals. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately escalating the issue to senior management for a blanket decision without a thorough internal investigation. This fails to provide management with the necessary data to make an informed judgment and bypasses the established risk assessment protocols. It can lead to decisions based on incomplete information or commercial pressure rather than a proper risk evaluation, potentially creating a precedent for policy disregard. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the finding as a minor procedural lapse, assuming no immediate harm has occurred. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the firm's internal controls and risk management framework. Such an attitude can foster a culture of non-compliance, making the firm vulnerable to more serious breaches and regulatory scrutiny. It also fails to address the underlying cause, which could lead to repeated or escalating issues. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize client retention above all else, seeking to find a way to accommodate the client's request without fully addressing the policy deviation. This is ethically unsound and poses a significant regulatory risk. It suggests that commercial interests can override established compliance procedures, which is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations and the firm's duty to operate within its risk appetite. This can lead to accusations of regulatory arbitrage or even complicity in non-compliant activities. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the facts and the regulatory context. This involves gathering all relevant information, identifying the specific policy or regulation that has been potentially breached, and assessing the nature and magnitude of the risk. The next step is to consult internal policies, procedures, and the firm's risk appetite statement. If the situation is complex or involves significant risk, seeking advice from compliance, legal, and senior management is crucial. The decision should then be documented, clearly articulating the rationale and the steps taken to mitigate any identified risks, ensuring alignment with regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal that the proposed implementation of a new cloud-based customer relationship management (CRM) system by the IT department has not undergone a comprehensive impact assessment that considers its potential effects on all critical business services, including sales, customer support, and marketing operations, over a potential disruption period of up to 72 hours. The assessment conducted by the IT team primarily focused on the technical feasibility and data migration aspects of the CRM system itself. Which of the following approaches best addresses the identified deficiency in the impact assessment process? Option A. Postpone the full impact assessment until after the CRM system has been fully implemented and is operational to gather real-world data on its performance and any issues that arise. Option B. Initiate a cross-functional working group comprising representatives from IT, sales, customer support, and marketing to conduct a detailed impact assessment, mapping dependencies, identifying potential failure points, and quantifying the potential duration and severity of disruption to each critical business service under various failure scenarios, and documenting these findings for regulatory review. Option C. Delegate the responsibility for the impact assessment to the head of sales, as they are the primary end user of the CRM system and will have the most direct insight into its operational impact. Option D. Request the IT department to expand their existing technical assessment to include a brief overview of how the new CRM system will benefit each business unit, assuming minimal disruption. The correct answer is B. Initiate a cross-functional working group comprising representatives from IT, sales, customer support, and marketing to conduct a detailed impact assessment, mapping dependencies, identifying potential failure points, and quantifying the potential duration and severity of disruption to each critical business service under various failure scenarios, and documenting these findings for regulatory review. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assessing the impact of a proposed change on a firm's operational resilience. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thoroughness with the practical constraints of time and resources, while ensuring that all potential risks are identified and adequately mitigated. A failure to conduct a comprehensive impact assessment could lead to unforeseen disruption, regulatory breaches, and significant financial or reputational damage. The firm must demonstrate to the regulator that it has a robust process for evaluating the potential consequences of significant changes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented evaluation of the proposed change's potential impact across all critical business services. This includes identifying dependencies, potential failure points, and the likely duration and severity of any disruption. It requires engaging relevant stakeholders from different departments to gather diverse perspectives and ensure all facets of the business are considered. This comprehensive methodology aligns with regulatory expectations for proactive risk management and demonstrates a commitment to maintaining operational resilience, as mandated by frameworks like the UK's Operational Resilience Regulations. The focus is on understanding the what-if scenario and their cascading effects. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the immediate team proposing the change to assess its impact. This fails to account for interdependencies and potential blind spots that individuals closer to the change might overlook. It represents a failure to adopt a holistic view, which is a cornerstone of effective operational resilience and a potential breach of the duty to conduct due diligence. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial assessment that only considers the most obvious and direct impacts, neglecting secondary or indirect consequences. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to adequately identify and assess all material risks, which is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements to understand the full scope of potential disruption. A third incorrect approach would be to defer the impact assessment to a later stage, such as after the change has been implemented. This is fundamentally flawed as it negates the purpose of an impact assessment, which is to inform decision-making before implementation. It represents a reactive rather than proactive stance, increasing the likelihood of significant operational failures and regulatory noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach impact assessments with a mindset of proactive risk identification and mitigation. This involves establishing a clear framework for assessment, defining the scope and methodology, and ensuring cross-functional collaboration. When faced with a proposed change, the decision-making process should involve 1. Clearly defining the change and its objectives. 2. Identifying all critical business services that could be affected. 3. Systematically assessing potential impacts on these services, considering various disruption scenarios. 4. Documenting the assessment findings, including identified risks and proposed mitigation strategies. 5. Seeking independent review and validation of the assessment. 6. Using the assessment to inform the decision to proceed, modify, or halt the change. Question 20. The performance metrics show a significant reduction in operational costs following the implementation of a new automated client onboarding system. However, there are anecdotal reports from the client services team suggesting a slight increase in initial client queries related to the new process, and a minor delay in the finalization of some account setups compared to the previous manual system. Which of the following approaches best addresses the potential impact of this operational change? Option A. Immediately revert to the previous manual onboarding system to eliminate any potential client dissatisfaction and avoid further operational disruption. Option B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the client services team's anecdotal reports to quantify the nature and frequency of client queries and delays, and assess their impact on client satisfaction and regulatory timelines. Option C. Focus solely on the efficiency gains and cost reductions, as the primary objective of the operational change was to improve the firm's financial performance. Option D. Rely on the documented cost savings as evidence that the operational change is beneficial, assuming any initial client issues are temporary and will resolve themselves. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed analysis of the client services team's anecdotal reports to quantify the nature and frequency of client queries and delays, and assess their impact on client satisfaction and regulatory timelines. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the assessment of the impact of a significant operational change on client outcomes and the firm's regulatory standing. The challenge lies in moving beyond mere data observation to a proactive and comprehensive evaluation of potential consequences, ensuring that client interests are protected and regulatory obligations are met. The firm must demonstrate a robust understanding of its responsibilities under the AON assessment framework, which necessitates a forward-looking approach to risk management and client service. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, multifaceted impact assessment. This includes a thorough review of the proposed changes, identification of potential risks to client portfolios, e.g., increased volatility, unintended tax consequences, deviation from investment objectives, and an evaluation of the firm's capacity to manage these risks effectively. It also requires assessing the impact on regulatory compliance, ensuring that the changes do not contravene any AON assessment guidelines or other relevant regulations. This approach aligns with the professional duty of care and the principles of good governance, prioritizing client well-being and regulatory adherence. It demonstrates a commitment to proactive risk mitigation and a client-centric operational model, which are fundamental to maintaining trust and integrity within the financial services industry. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely focus on the cost-saving benefits of the operational change without adequately considering the potential negative impacts on clients or regulatory compliance. This approach fails to uphold the fiduciary duty owed to clients and disregards the principle that operational efficiency should not come at the expense of client outcomes or regulatory integrity. It represents a significant ethical failure by prioritizing financial gain over client welfare and regulatory responsibility. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the change is internal and does not directly alter client instructions, no external impact assessment is necessary. This overlooks the indirect but potentially significant consequences that operational changes can have on service delivery, client experience, and the firm's ability to meet its ongoing obligations. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to appreciate the interconnectedness of internal operations and external client impact, which is a breach of professional standards and potentially regulatory requirements. A further incorrect approach is to delegate the impact assessment entirely to a single department without cross-functional oversight or senior management review. This can lead to a narrow or incomplete analysis, missing critical perspectives from compliance, risk management, or client-facing teams. It undermines the principle of robust internal controls and can result in a superficial assessment that fails to identify all material risks, thereby exposing the firm to regulatory scrutiny and client dissatisfaction. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and comprehensive approach to impact assessment. This involves defining the scope of the assessment, identifying all relevant stakeholders, gathering data from multiple sources, analyzing potential positive and negative impacts, and developing mitigation strategies. A critical element is the integration of regulatory and ethical considerations throughout the process. Professionals should always ask, what are the potential consequences of this action for our clients, our firm's reputation, and our regulatory obligations? This proactive and holistic mindset ensures that decisions are made in the best interests of all parties and in compliance with the highest professional standards.